While attending the commemorations in Berlin marking the 80th anniversary of the failed assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler on July 20th, 2024, I also spoke with several young participants who asked me why there had been so little resistance within the Wehrmacht against the authoritarian Nazi regime. For it is undisputed that a change of regime would still have been possible even after the Nazi system had consolidated its power through terror, bans, and persecution, because the Wehrmacht had all the means to do so, if only the generals had been willing. But why did they continue to support the so-called Führer state under the sole ruler Hitler until the bitter end? Politicians, business leaders, intellectuals, and above all, the highest-ranking generals? Answers to this can be found in the statements and justifications recorded in the files of the Nuremberg trials against the main war criminals, as well as in the so-called Führer conferences of the Navy, and in the later testimonies of Hitler's closest men, if they survived the Nuremberg trials, such as Albert Speer, who from 1942 served as Reich Minister for Armaments and Munitions, or Grand Admiral Dönitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Navy. In 1943, following a meeting with Hitler, he wrote, "The tremendous force the Führer radiates, his unwavering confidence, and his forward-looking assessment of the situation in Italy made it very clear these days that, compared to the Führer, we are all rather pitiful little sausages, that our knowledge, our view of things from our limited sector, is merely patchwork. Anyone who thinks they could do better than the Führer is foolish." With that, Dönitz, who, from May 8, 1945, until his arrest in a Flensburg barracks, served for 23 days as the last head of state of Germany, which was then occupied by the three victorious powers, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, along with France, eager to be included in the division of the spoils, had hit the nail on the head. For the fact that they were all, as he put it, rather pitiful little sausages, was not only due to their political naivety and their predominantly narrow, military-focused education, but also to the age-old system of divide and rule, tested since ancient Rome and practiced by Hitler as well. And secondly, the deliberate withholding of information from those around him, something they all accepted without objection. After dismissing the commander-in-chief of the army, Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, who had served from 1938 to 1941, on December 19, 1941, der Führer took sole command of the army and largely kept them confined to the so-called Führer headquarters, either Wehrwolf north of Vinnytsia in Ukraine or the Wolf's Lair in Rastenburg, East Prussia. Colonel General Alfred Jodl would later describe the Wolf's Lair during the Nuremberg trials as not just a mix between a monastery and a concentration camp, but also a place into which very little entered apart from situation reports. And even those few pieces of information, he said, were censored and made accessible only to a limited circle by Hitler's direct order. As a result, the Army High Command responsible for the war against the Soviet Union, OKH, received little to no insight into the reports of the Foreign Office, while the Foreign Office, in turn, did not receive the intelligence gathered by the Military Secret Service under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, which was based in the Bendler Block. As for the Reich Cabinet, which, following the Enabling Act of March 24, 1933, met only 19 times until the end of the war in 1945, its final meeting took place on April 26, 1942, in the Kroll Opera House, which faced the Reichstag that had burned down in 1933 and was thereafter used as a substitute parliament. From that point on, the so-called Führer decrees issued by Hitler, also referred to as Führer orders or Führer directives, had the same legal standing as laws passed by the Reichstag, which meant that, de facto, there was no longer a functioning Reich government. But even before that, communication between Hitler and the individual ministers had become isolated, sometimes taking place in direct conversation, but often mediated through the head of the Reich Chancellery, the jurist and state secretary Hans Heinrich Lammers, or through the increasingly powerful and opaque head of the NSDAP party chancellery Martin Bormann, who operated from the so-called Brown House in Munich, and, from 1941 onward, from the former Prussian state ministry. He was known as the Führer's Brown Shadow. None of the ministers, who had been reduced to mere extras and order takers, put up any resistance. No resignations occurred until the very end. The most important among them were found guilty and executed at the Nuremberg trials, or had already evaded responsibility beforehand by committing suicide. In any case, Hitler, who was more of a commander than a leader, had ensured with the method he used that no one around him knew more than he wanted them to. Or, as Donitz later stated, only the Führer had the complete picture. The effect was that no one could discuss with him on the basis of equal knowledge. That also applied to the generals, towards whom he used another rhetorical trick that didn't allow any possible contradiction to arise in the first place. Examples. If the aforementioned Colonel General Jodl raised objections to a military plan with Hitler, Hitler would counter with political reasons to which the general could not respond. And when Armaments Minister Speer brought up economic considerations, Hitler rejected them for supposed strategic reasons. With such verbal sleight of hand, Hitler often ended uncomfortable discussions. But if someone did persist with their objections, it usually happened only internally, because outwardly, the main actors often continued to play the role of loyal collaborators, even though they knew better. Thus, Colonel General Jodl, even on November 7, 1943, 9 months after the catastrophe at Stalingrad in February, the surrender of the German-Italian troops in Africa in May, the Allied landing in Sicily in July, and the Allied landing on the Italian mainland in September, ended his lengthy speech in Munich on the strategic situation and Hitler's genius with the following words: "But my deepest confidence is based on the fact that at the head of Germany stands a man who can only have been destined by fate to lead our people into a brighter future. In spite of all contrary opinions, I must express here that he is the soul not only of political, but also of military leadership in this war, and that the strength of his will, the creative richness of his thoughts, pulses through and holds together the entire armed forces." It would be interesting to know whom General Jodl meant when he spoke of contrary opinions. Did he mean at that time the majority of the German generals, of whom probably only a small number would have confirmed this judgment about Hitler's supposed military leadership after the disasters that had already occurred at the fronts? But that Hitler was the driving force behind the continuation of the war was undisputed. The rapid victories over Poland, France, and in the Balkans, as well as his stubborn order to hold the line during the dramatic winter crisis before Moscow in 1941, which, in his view, had prevented the worst, were, for him, proof of his infallibility and strength of will. Hitler's favorite minister, Albert Speer, the prototype of the uncritical technocrat found in all regimes, who after the war actually managed, through a clever mix of truth and lies, to present himself to the Allies as, quote, "the good Nazi," confirmed this while in American captivity. In Hitler's opinion, military leadership was a matter of intelligence, persistence, and nerves of steel. He told himself that he possessed these qualities to a much greater extent than any of his generals. He told himself that he alone was tough and unyielding enough to withstand the blows of fate. And Speer further reported that Hitler was convinced that in war, it simply came down to having the courage to be even tougher and more brutal than the enemy, to be willing to risk everything in attack and not to yield an inch in defense. These, in reality, were the highest military qualities which, regardless of the balance of material forces on both sides, would bring about victory. Historians have indeed credited Hitler with a sense for favorable strategic conditions and for unorthodox, unexpected actions, such as the so-called sickle cut operation, approved by him and developed in 1940, by Lieutenant General Erich von Manstein as the operational plan for the defeat of France. But a good poker player must also have these qualities, namely to play in a way that the other players do not expect. But war is not a card game, where losing has at most individual consequences. By contrast, Hitler lacked any real understanding of how to command army groups in large-scale military formations, especially once the fronts had become entrenched against equally matched opponents, despite his intense and thorough study of key military literature from previous centuries. In reality, his broad self-taught theoretical knowledge was actually counterproductive, because that alone did not compensate for his often lacking understanding of how to handle large and complex operations, but instead repeatedly led to fruitless monologues in front of the trained soldiers. Anyone who now argues that he contributed significantly to the early successes in the war with his unburdened approach, free from already practiced methods, free from restrictive knowledge of regulations, and free from textbook or ideal solutions taught in general staff courses, only needs to look at the images from the last years of the war. Because once the tide of the war had turned, it was no longer enough to conduct war using the methods he had successfully applied in politics. Politically, he was always authoritarian and never even tried to convince his political opponents through discussion based on logic and reasoning. In contrast, he consistently proclaimed his own statements as the sole salvific truths and ridiculed those of his opponents. By 1943, as Germany had lost the initiative due to the changing course of the war, and Hitler was unwilling to seek any form of peace agreement, what was needed was the political wisdom of an Otto von Bismarck or the military acumen of a Helmuth von Moltke the Elder, not his increasingly entrenched habit, as commander-in-chief of the army, of having tactical measures at the battalion level presented to him from hundreds of kilometers behind the front, and then altering them by means of Führer orders. This practice had begun in the first Russian winter, when Adolf Hitler loudly blamed the Wehrmacht's weakness on the lack of decisiveness among the higher commanders, and ordered that, from then on, no commander was allowed to carry out retreat or withdrawal movements, even within a narrow tactical framework, without his approval. The result was that now the highest military leaders neglected their actual task, which was to plan operations, and instead, from a military perspective, occupied themselves with trivialities. But this system, created by his sole command and further fueled by his supposed brilliant intuition and infallibility, the mantra being, "The Führer is always right," led him more and more to behave like a reckless gambler relying on luck, only to lapse into complete lethargy weeks later. For months, important decisions were postponed and all defenses collapsed on one front. He blamed this on his military entourage, who, with only a few exceptions, remained obedient and silent. When, in the final 2 years, he shut himself off from all reality, it became pathological. This led Colonel General Franz Halder, who had served as Chief of the Army General Staff until September 24th, 1942, to state after the war, strategic problems were not approached according to any long-term plan, nor even examined in the light of a comprehensive, objective assessment of the facts. Adolf Hitler lived in a world of self-deception and overestimation, which prevented him from distinguishing the possible from the impossible. In his headquarters, intuition prevailed over reason, improvisation over planning. In fact, after October 1942, no studies on far-reaching plans were made anymore, because they could only lead to conclusions that Adolf Hitler would not have accepted. It can be assumed that most of the higher commanders were well aware of the devastating consequences of such amateurish supreme leadership. But due to the obedience instilled in them, they still accepted Adolf Hitler's tyrannical and arbitrary control without serious opposition. Certainly some, such as Field Marshals Erich von Manstein, Ewald von Kleist, or Georg von Küchler, were transferred to the Führer's reserve in 1944, but only due to disagreements over operational matters, not over the futility of continuing the war. They may have complained about him behind his back, but when it came to telling him to his face what they thought of his misguided decisions, or going even further and removing him from power, they remained passive. It can be stated even more clearly. As good opportunists, they had cast aside their principles and conscience and kept climbing higher and higher up the military ladder. In truth, that made them the main culprits of Germany's catastrophe. For against their better military judgment, they followed a dilettante to the bitter end and, by remaining in office, not only became complicit in the deaths of millions, but also enabled the atrocities of which they had become fully aware. After the war, they denied all responsibility and referred to the oath they had sworn in 1934, but they ignored the fact that Hitler, upon his appointment as Chancellor on January 30th, 1933, had repeatedly violated the oath he had taken to uphold the Constitution of the Weimar Republic, for he had sworn to preserve the Constitution and the laws and to conduct the affairs of government impartially and justly toward all. As for obedience, many of the highest military leaders, trained at the Prussian Main Cadet Institute in Groß-Lichterfelde near Berlin, should have remembered the motto inscribed on the wall of the Field Marshal's Hall. Prussian obedience is that of a free decision, not that of submissive willingness to serve. Now, however, people also point to other social groups, such as lawyers, doctors, or business leaders, and argue that they all went along as well and couldn't do much against Hitler. In doing so, we forget the most important thing. After the Nazi regime consolidated its power, the Gestapo, under Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler, had taken total control, and the civilian opposition had been largely crushed. Only the Wehrmacht could have brought about a radical change of regime. But after accepting the numerous murders during the so-called Röhm Putsch in June 1934, swearing their oath to Hitler, and witnessing the rapid expansion of the Wehrmacht with an abundance of new high-ranking posts, many found the privileged life more important than any remembrance of old Prussian virtues. When, during the largely forgotten so-called September Conspiracy of 1938, Lieutenant Colonel Hans Oster of the Abwehr, together with General of the Artillery Ludwig Beck, former mayor of Leipzig Karl Goerdeler, and General of the Infantry Erwin von Witzleben, sought to stop Hitler, 99.9% of the generals failed to act. But an end to the Nazi regime would still have been possible in the early years of the war. But even then, personal careers, sweetened with promotions, medals, and large sums of money, were more important to many than the fate of Germany, which by then was fighting against the whole world with second- and third-rate allies. The terrible thing about the generals' failure was that not a few of them had rejected or even despised Hitler, his party, and his policies. Only after the Allied invasion of Normandy had succeeded on June 6, 1944, and the Soviet Operation Bagration had destroyed Army Group Center on June 22nd, did the groups around Colonel General Ludwig Beck, Karl Friedrich Goerdeler, Major General Henning von Treschow, General of the Infantry Friedrich Olbricht, and Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg decide to carry out the assassination attempt of July 20th. Before that, the regime had been relatively secure when it came to resistance within the Wehrmacht. Because how did one of their highest representatives in Hitler's inner circle, General Keitel, praise him after the arrival of the French request for an armistice on June 17, 1940? "My Führer, you are the greatest military commander of all time." Of course, not everyone was such an obedient sycophant like Keitel, who was secretly nicknamed Lacker Keitel behind his back. But even a man with impressive abilities in his field, like the Minister of Armaments Speer, later described this phenomenon, which remains incomprehensible to us to this day, in just a few sentences. Everyone who worked with him for a long time was completely dependent on him and devoted, no matter how strong they appeared in their own environment. In his presence, they became insignificant and shy. Cowardice alone doesn't explain that. As a result of their long collaboration, they not only developed an uncanny faith in him, but also fell completely under his influence. They were under his spell, blindly devoted to him and without their own will. But how such faith and such devotion could arise among such a large number of intelligent people, I cannot answer. The last question that remains is whether a dictatorship could be possible again in our country. The answer is a definite no, also because all the necessary conditions for it are truly lacking. Therefore, discussions about this are the height of pointless futility, as they only distract from the real problems of our time,